The goal of every peak is simple. Lift your heaviest weights on the right day. But most lifters either miss the mark or get there wrecked. After 20 plus years of coaching, here's how I peak my athletes for big performances on the platform. Okay, what is the goal of a peaking block and why are we doing it? I'm gonna break this video down to 3 different parts so we can dig deep and cover exactly what you need to know about peaking. First, what is the goal of a peaking block? Second, we're gonna cover how do we accomplish those goals. And then third, how do you individualize and adapt a peaking block to fit yourself or your athlete's needs? So, first and foremost, what is the goal of a peaking block? Well, there are 3 main goals to peaking. And in a peaking block, we need to satisfy all 3 of these goals. Number 1 is going to be decay fatigue. What this means is during the training cycle, as you've gotten all this volume and intensity and you've built up and trained super hard, your body is going to be basically holding on to a lot of fatigue from that incredibly large training load. And you want to make sure that going into the competition at the end of the peaking block, you have decayed any of the fatigue that's residual, that's holding on to, that you're holding on to. What that looks like is a reduction in training volume. It's a reduced amount of stress, a reduced amount of training load. That can come in multiple ways. So you could reduce fatigue or decay fatigue by cutting volume down, 15, 20, 30%, maybe even more in some cases. You could reduce fatigue by reducing the number or the amount of exercises in the program. So you're narrowing that list down from maybe 15 or 20 different movements to 2 or 3 or 4. Any of these things that essentially would reduce overall fatigue and overall exertion that's gonna make that much more easy to recover from and end up at the competition with completely recovered body. The second thing, as far as what's the goal of peaking, is to increase the exposure. So increase the exposure to competition lifts, okay? And what that means is that we wanna make sure that after we've decayed fatigue, after our athlete is completely recovered, the secondary goal is to make sure we've maximized the amount of training exposure to high intensity lifts that mimic the sport itself. Weightlifting is a sport where you do 1 rep maxes on a platform. You do a heavy snatch, heavy clean and jerk. So we have to increase the exposure or at least isolate our training down to just the heavy exposure to snatch and clean and jerk only. This is gonna basically put you in the best position you can be in to perform at a competition at the highest level. If you are in the peaking phase and you're incorporating or still doing very high volume kinds of training, that is not necessarily indicative of what you're gonna be doing on the platform. It's just a counterproductive sort of exercise in futility. You're not really gonna get much out of that because it doesn't mimic the exact sport you're trying to do, which is lifting the heaviest weight you can. So increase in exposure to the competition lifts, right? You're gonna focus on basically classic snatch, classic clean and jerk, and that's about it, outside of whatever else you need to support that stuff. So heavier squats, maybe some heavy pulls here and there, but not a ton of bodybuilding and single joint exercises. Number 3 is going to be to taper and prepare for the competition. So to taper and prepare for the comp. And my writing is getting better as we go. To taper and prepare for the competition is in and of itself its own sort of process, its own thing. Tapering really is the same thing as deloading, with the exception that you're trying to reduce as much fatigue and as much unnecessary things happening in the program as possible, so that on the day of the competition, you're in the best position you can be to perform. Tapering is really just a fancy word for deload, basically. You're just eliminating all the things you would normally do during a deload down to almost nothing, to where at the end of the taper week or the taper period, you might be doing 60% snatch and clean and jerk, and that's it, and there's nothing else going on. Something else that kind of goes hand in hand with tapering is not just a gradual reduction in volume, but it's also a increase in the mental preparation for the competition. This is not necessarily the only time you could do it, but it's one of the better times to spend time focusing on the competition plan, rehearsing what your lifts are going to be on the platform so you have an idea of when I get to the platform or my athlete steps on the platform, we have all 6 lifts planned out. We know exactly what we're going to take. We have contingency plans, so if the athlete goes out and does their first lift and then they get red lights, what are they doing for their second? If they make their second, what do they do on their third, right? So you want to have all of this planned out, not because you're going to do exactly what's on the paper, but you want to make sure you're ready for any scenario and you've considered any possible options. You should have a plan to know what you're going to do if your athlete misses their first and second attempts, right? Or if you miss your first and second attempt, or if you miss your opener, then make your second, and then what do you do on your third? You have to really be aware of what that plan is so you don't get into a position where competition starts, everything falls apart, things go totally south, you don't know what's happening, and you're trying to figure it out on the spot. It's just gonna be a mess, and it's just kind of a breeding ground. That scenario is a breeding ground for all kinds of bad decisions where you might miss a lift, or athlete misses a lift, and you go up and wait, and then they miss again, then you go up again, and there's a bomb out, and it's just all of those things you don't want to have to think about. You want that plan. So the taper and the competition prep at the end of the peaking block is really a good time to solidify all of that, because you now should know exactly what shape the athlete's in, what their goals and priorities are, and what's most important on that list so you can know what to focus on. Real quick, if you're looking for a personalized, adaptive weightlifting program that's made completely for you and adapts daily to your needs, check out Weightlifting AI. It is the only product of its kind. It has been battle tested by thousands of lifters who are hitting PRs every day, and you can try it for 2 weeks completely free by using the code 2weektrial at checkout. It's the first link in the description of this video. The second part here is, how do we accomplish these goals? How do we accomplish a decrease in fatigue? How do we decay fatigue? How do we increase the exposure to the competition lifts? How do we taper? So the simplest way to describe this is, we first, to decay fatigue, is we are going to lower volume and or frequency, right? That's how you spell frequency. So when you reduce training volume, you're inevitably going to decay some fatigue, but at the same time, if you're already doing a program or your athlete is training in a way where they don't have the ability to reduce much volume, maybe they've been doing very small sessions and the workouts are not that big, and you're getting to a point where, hey, you need to taper, how do you reduce the stress on that athlete without just eliminating the entire training session? Well, you could reduce the frequency. You could go from training the snatch or the clean and jerk heavy twice a week to every 9 days or every 10 days, in which case you're able to add in technical sessions to maintain that skill, but at the same time, you're reducing the frequency of when those heavy sessions occur. So 1 or 2 strategies is the option here. You could do both, you could do one or the other. In general, most people are gonna just reduce training volume, and that's that's more than enough to accommodate for basically everybody out there. Some people will need to reduce frequency as well. Some people will only reduce frequency. But yeah, you kind of have to play with this and figure out what works for you and your athletes. What is accompanied by this is a reduction of non-specific, meaning work that is not contributing to the direct results of the snatch and clean and jerk, non-specific work in order to free up resources to recover from training, and at the same time, it's a fast way to, an easy way to reduce total training volume. So we reduce basically all of the bodybuilding accessory work, all the stuff that we were doing before to support the lifts. A lot of that gets eliminated. So pulling, squatting volume comes down a ton. All the secondary exercises, the hang snatches and power snatches and these kind of things get reduced as well. So most of your volume is then focused and concentrated on just the classic lifts. Next is increase in, so more competition, comp lifts, more comp lifts overall. And really that's just gonna be an increase in the frequency of competition lifts, so you're doing them more often than you were. This is maybe at the beginning of the peaking phase. You're gonna increase the volume of these as well. It doesn't mean you're doubling or tripling the volume, but you might add in several more singles into those sessions. And that's really just to increase your exposure to those lifts so you're familiar with the skill of lifting heavy weights, but also exactly what it's gonna be like on competition day when you've touched a bunch of heavy singles or a bunch of high intensity lifts, or you're really familiar with what that feels like. During the competition phase or the peaking phase, you're probably not making a ton of new adaptations that make you much stronger. You're just trying to realize the gains you've already made from the previous phases. And so increasing competition lifts is just basically allowing you to give your body exposure to the lifts that are gonna matter, and that power you've developed in the previous training blocks should transfer well to that. You're gonna have an increase in intensity. So an increase in intensity. This is kind of obvious, as we know that an increase in the competition lifts with heavy weights is gonna drive intensity up because those lifts are heavier. But it's obvious that as we get closer to the competition in the peaking phase, we are driving intensity up as well, because we want to increase the average weight of the bar. We want to increase our exposure to the peak weights that we're gonna be close to in competition, or maybe even above in some cases. But that's basically the simplest thing there. The next two things are you're going to, and this is more for the taper portion, but you're going to define the timeline and individualize it. So we want to define, oh, that's a G, define the timeline. I'm writing my E's as G's, I don't know why. Define the timeline and individualize. So what that means is in the taper, you wanna figure out for yourself or your athlete, when is the day that I take my last heavy snatch and clean and jerk? When is the day I take my openers? When is the last day that I do the lifts at all? And what days in between those is something happening or something not happening? If we're reducing frequency like we talked about up here, this is gonna make sense as well, because you're basically taking your timeline and saying, well, I'm a big lifter, I'm 110 kilos and I'm gonna be competing and I need more rest. So I'll take my last heavy snatch and clean and jerk 10 days before the event, and then those 10 days going in afterward will be mostly light lifts, maybe a few days that are 80 or 85%, but nothing super heavy from that last day to the meet. Maybe you're a small 48 kilo woman and you are 15 years old and you recover instantly from no matter what you do. You might have a timeline that's much shorter. It might be that you stop your last heavy day on Monday and you compete on Friday. So again, this is something you have to be considering when you're tapering, is when do I take my last heavy days? When do I take my openers? How is this timeline set up so that when I actually get to the competition, I did everything I could to prepare myself to have the best day on that day I'm lifting. And then the final piece for the peaking block is the competition plan, right? So the comp plan. This to me is something that I think gets overlooked a lot, but what you want to do is during this month, during this peaking phase, is really think about what is our strategy and plan, knowing what the previous training cycle that you just ended or you're about to end, what has that produced? Did you gain a 10 kilo increase in your snatch and 15 in your clean and jerk? Did you not make any progress? That would not be a listener of my videos. Obviously, they're going to do really well. But if you're in a place where those results are kind of murky, you're not sure what you've accomplished, you need to get more definitive with your plan, because you can't just assume that, oh, we'll go to the meet and we'll be up 10 or 15 kilos because we just trained for 6 months. So you should really be aware of what you've got going into this and then use that to set the foundation for what your competition plan is going to look like. If you made a bunch of PRs and that was 3 weeks before the meet, or 5 weeks before the meet, and you're like a couple weeks out with your peaking phase, then yeah, factor that in. If you didn't make any PRs, but your squat strength and power snatch and all the accessory movements went up a ton, yeah, maybe factor that in and think that, hey, you're probably stronger, but you got to be conservative on your opener because you haven't touched those weights enough. Obviously, if you're increasing competition lifts, you're gonna have to touch them, but you get the idea that really the competition plan is really important to take an audit of what you've got as far as abilities and skills and strengths going into the meet, so you don't end up in a place where you're sort of hoping for something, or you have a lot of wishful thinking that, oh, I'm gonna go and I can do X, Y, Z lifts because I felt good 3 months ago. That's kind of the gist of what we want to do, how we want to accomplish the goals of a peaking phase, what we need to do as far as a checklist. Now I wanna talk a little bit about how do we apply this stuff to ourselves and to our athletes. And there are two different ways to do this. So one is through experimentation. Okay? Hopefully that's spelled right. So experimentation is really just gonna be small experiments throughout the process of running athletes through competitions. Coaches have a little bit easier time with this because they can try different things with different athletes and get a general idea if it's gonna work. But experimentation should really look like you're testing different loading schemes. So how often are we doing heavy lifts? How many heavy lifts are we doing? You're gonna see if there are potentially different arrangements of maybe we do our heavy snatch and our heavy clean and jerk on 2 separate days going into the taper. A lot of different things, but experimentation should really just be running some small tests and running some small ideas by yourself or by your athlete and seeing how those perform. If you do something that's a little bit unorthodox, and it works really well, that's great, because you might not have discovered that if you weren't doing experimentation. If you just took the status quo of, hey, everybody does their last heavy day on the Saturday before the meet, and then they do their openers on Tuesday or Monday, and then they go to the meet, you'll never learn those things. And it's very beneficial for athletes that need unique situations because for whatever reason they benefit from them. So experimentation is very important. The next one is individualization, and this really comes down to the same thing as experimentation. Are we actually, are we actually doing something in the training process that is designed specifically for that athlete based on the requirements that athlete has as far as what they need to be successful at a meet? Basically, the two things are you adjusting the peaking block based on their strengths and weaknesses? Are you dialing in the amount of training they're doing or expanding the number of competition lifts they're doing based on what they actually need? Or are you just doing this based off of what you think is right or what's worked for somebody else? Individualization is a really big part of training. It's a really big part of being successful with the program, because if you don't do this, you are going to miss out on the most progress somebody could make. And that's unfortunate because it really isn't a difficult process to implement experimentation to find different things that work for an athlete. Caveat with this, you have to be a little bit careful with individualization and experimentation in the peaking block because you're not given a lot of chances to screw it up. So make your adjustments small, but really keep track of what they are. If you find that, hey, this athlete just does really well when they have more rest, give them more rest. If you find that they're going into a competition and they're feeling like they aren't in good shape for the meet, then maybe you're taking away too much volume or not giving them enough exposure to heavy lifts. So be aware of these things. I would recommend taking notes, really write this stuff down and keep track of what's going on in that peaking block and what happens at the meet so you have an idea of what really is going down with that person. If you don't do that and you just kind of keep in the back of your mind, you're unlikely to walk away from that scenario and actually have learned anything, and down the line you're gonna forget it, and so on and so forth. Just not a good strategy. Overall, peaking, we know the goal: decay fatigue, increase competition lift exposure, and get people prepared through a taper for the competition. How we accomplish that, we just outlined. We wanna make sure we're doing everything in our part to optimize the training for the athlete through experimentation and individualizing the training process and the peaking process so that they have a great meet. And if you're an athlete, that's what you need to be doing, and that's what your coach needs to be doing. And if you're a coach, you better be doing it. And if not, tell your athletes to give me a call and I will help them out. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and then check out my other video in this series on programming on strength development for weightlifting.